Professor Shuichi Hasegawa. Welcome to Paris. Welcome to the Fondation Hugot. And you will lecture in the Collège de France about the Bible and archaeology, so how Bible can be instructed or better understood with the help of archaeology. But I'm a little bit curious. My first question is, how does it come that a Japanese scholar is interested in a very Western product, in a way, the Bible, and then going digging in Israel? So maybe you can tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. Since my childhood, I was interested in history. I started with the Japanese history, and I also started being interested in Western culture. And I found very fascinating the kind of mainstreams beneath the Western culture. One is, of course, the Bible, and one is perhaps the Greek, Roman culture. So in the high school, I started to read the Bible, and at my university, there was a course called the History of Ancient Israel. There I found the combination of the Bible and history, which are the two interesting disciplines for me. So I decided to go on my research.
Okay. And then you went to Israel, to University of Tel Aviv. So you learned modern Hebrew, and so what were the important things that you learned when you were studying in Israel? It was on the Bible, it was also on archaeology, I guess.
Yes, yes. My supervisor was Professor Nadav Neiman. He's an excellent historian of the history of ancient Israel. And I was also involved in an excavation which was conducted by the Japanese expedition, and I started digging with them since 1998, and then I went to study at Tel Aviv University since 2000. I took many courses of archaeology, like Akkadian and Mesopotamian civilization, Semitic languages. And yeah, but actually I didn't take any archaeology classes at all. Yeah.
But you had already experience in archaeology,
Yes,
because
yes,
you were digging
in Japan.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
So you have today like a double formation in biblical scholarship,
Yes.
and in archaeology.
Yes, exactly.
And so can you tell us a little bit, now you're also, of course, you're teaching, you're researching, but you also regularly go to Israel for excavation, and now you're the chief of this excavation. So can you tell us a little bit about the site and why it's important for our understanding of the history of ancient Israel, of the Bible? And, did you have any important discoveries so far?
Well, yes. Now we are digging the site called Tel Rekhesh. It is located in the Lower Galilee, and we started digging there since 2006. And we have found so far many, not big discoveries, but artifacts and structures. It is inhabited from the early Bronze Age until the Roman period, almost continuously. So
some 1,000 years,
3,000 years of history. What is most fascinating was that the building that we found last summer, and we think that it is a very early synagogue, dated to the 1st century, before the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans.
Okay.
There are only several examples of such
early synagogues. Yes.
So
and what are the indications that you can think that is a synagogue?
Actually, very typical building of the early synagogue. They have benches all around the walls. And we have excavated only the western side, and it is encircled by the benches. So it is a very good example. And our colleague, who is the specialist of the Roman archaeology, who believes that it is, or it should be a synagogue. Yeah.
And is there any decoration? Because in some synagogues, early synagogues, we know there are some decoration. Did
Not
you find
yet.
some?
We
Not
haven't
yet.
found. That's
So
this year.
You're going on this year.
Yes, we will excavate the eastern side, which we think that the entrance is located. So perhaps we will find something.
Maybe we'll find something. Yes.
And we also have found fragments of frescoes.
From which period? From the same period?
From the Roman period. Yes.
Okay. And can this site be located to any text in the Bible, or no?
Well, not the Roman period, but some scholars identified it with Anaharat, mentioned in the book of Joshua, chapter 19, verse 19. It is one of the important cities during the late Bronze Age, also mentioned in the Egyptian documents.
So, this afternoon you will speak about how archaeology can help to better understand the Bible. It was always a complicated situation between archaeology in Israel and biblical scholars. So some archaeologists often thought that they can prove that the Bible was right, and the biblical scholars sometimes were a little bit cautious about archaeology. So how would you see the relation, or what would be a good relation? And maybe also you can give us some examples you would like to mention in your lecture.
First of all, what I think important is that we should be very humble, because nowadays the disciplines are very, complicated, and if you want to master one discipline, it will take a long time. And very specialized archaeology, not only archaeology, but botanical or fauna and so on. So archaeologists cannot be biblical scholar.
Yes. There was
at the same time, it's very difficult.
There was this famous debate between your supervisor, Professor Neyman, and Israel Finkelstein, whether the archaeology can be the high court of biblical studies. So you don't think it can be the high court archaeology?
Well, perhaps in a certain circumstance, perhaps, but not always. And archaeologists should know that and always have to think about it, because archaeology cannot discover everything that had happened in the past.
Right, and archaeology often is also like biblical scholarship. It's also a question of interpretation. You find something. It's not always so clear what it is, how precisely you can date it, and how to interpret the facts. So it's not, because sometimes I think people think that archaeology is like a hard science, and archaeology can prove or can disprove this and this fact. And I think it's, as you say also, it's a little bit more complicated probably.
It is. Yeah, that's, for example, at our site, Tel Rekhesh should be very prosperous in the late Bronze Age. But unfortunately, we cannot find monumental buildings from that period, although many sporadic information and architecture, but not gorgeous findings. And I guess because in the later periods, the building activities destroyed and erased everything to build new buildings on it. So it could happen. And even if it is mentioned in historical text, archaeology cannot do almost anything about it.
That's very true. So maybe you can give us some examples about topics that you think where archaeology can help to understand the Bible in a new way or in a better way. What would you think is important?
Well, I think the accumulation of data archaeological data could contribute to the understanding, not a single artifact discovered in the excavation. Well, it could help something if it is, for example, an inscription or so.
Right, yeah.
But the accumulation of data, like the settlement pattern of the early Iron Age, will perhaps contribute to understanding how the Bible relates the history of the settlement in early Israel, if it is historic or not, perhaps.
Yes, yeah, okay. For instance, if we take the conquest account in the book of Joshua, do you think that archaeology can definitely exclude that such a conquest ever happened in the 13th, 12th century, or you think it's more complicated?
It is more complicated, I guess, because as I said, and there is also limits of the survey, archaeological survey. For example, again, my site, it was surveyed several times, and each surveyors reported, okay, this site has this period, this period, this period. But after we excavated, they were proved to be wrong, actually. Yeah.
So also archaeology, I think it's like biblical scholarship. They make progress, and what they said in the beginning of the 20s or in the middle of the 20th century is maybe not really so hard fact as they presented it in the time, I think so. And you think also about these new methods we have now in archaeology, also like interest in soil archaeology, and you mentioned botanics and alimentation, food habits. You think this is a progress and this can teach us something new?
Indeed, indeed a progress, and we will perhaps deepen our understanding of the past society from the material culture viewpoint. Yes.
And you spoke about inscriptions. The problem often for biblical scholars is that in the land of Israel there are very few monumental inscriptions. This is, of course, if you go to Mesopotamia, to Egypt, wherever, you find a lot. And we are kind of frustrated often because, we have the measure stela, but this is on the other side of the Jordan. So, have you any explanation why there is so few monumental inscriptions and also relatively few literacy in a way, if you compare to other regions in the Levant?
Yeah, a possible explanation is that perhaps they used more materials which can be not preserved.
Oh, which perish easily, like papyrus for instance. Yes. And what would you think are the most important archaeological discovery in Israel, let's say, for the last 10 15 years?
It's hard to say.
What about Khirbet Kayafa? You think it's an important site?
It is one of the important inscriptions, but unfortunately we cannot decipher precisely what is written, and it's still in the debate. Last 10.
Yeah.
Well, I guess if it is in the 20th century, definitely the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Of course, yes. Yeah, and now we're celebrating 70 years of discovery of the Dead Scrolls. That is for sure, because before we had almost no material evidence for biblical manuscripts at that time, and I think that was, of course, very, very important. And it's true that so far we have, of course, the amulets of Ketephinom, but they are very, very limited just to one text of the Bible. But so I think indeed that the Dead Sea Scrolls are certainly very, very important. And then if we come back to this side of Khirbet Kayafa, sometimes it's also interesting, if you speak about relation Bible and archaeology, that sometimes we find sites, also like Ramat Rachel, we find sites that are not really mentioned in the Bible, or we can discuss eventually if they can be identified to this and this location, but it's not evident, so it's not so easy. What does this tell us about the way we should use the Bible as a historical document, or maybe more generally, how we should relate then archaeology to the biblical account?
Well, the two disciplines must be separated at the beginning, and after each research elucidate or discover the results of the research, and then one can, after that, synthesize the results. It's always I try to do. It's very difficult because you must be always objective, but it's very hard to be objective.
But do you think it would be possible to write a history of Israel if we had only archaeology, if we didn't have the Bible?
I don't think so. Because
there were some attempts, you know, like Lemke, but I don't think it's possible.
No, I don't think it's possible either. And if you don't use the text, it is very fragmentary information about material culture, and material culture perhaps can contribute to understand the society, but it's only one aspect or two aspects of the society. And for example, the political history, it is very hard to consider or reconstruct based only on the archaeological.
So maybe for concluding remarks, how would you say, or what would be the best way? You said both disciplines should be separated. But in a way, I think there's also need for collaboration in a way. And so how would you see, how should biblical scholars and archaeologists of the land of Israel should collaborate?
We need to discuss, and a dialogue, a sincere dialogue is the necessary thing. And that is what I am going to do next week in Munich. I invited Assyriologists, archaeologists, and biblical scholars to discuss the last days of the northern kingdom of Israel. And each will present his or her ideas from own perspective. And then we will discuss and we will look for the landing point at the end. So I think that's the only way, because disciplines are so specialized, and people cannot understand everything by themselves. So I think we should discuss, and discuss.
Thank you very much for having come to Paris, and we're looking forward to your lectures. Thank you.
Thank you.